Welcome back to episode 43 now of the Locker Room Podcast. My name is Ross Bennett. I'm the host for today, and I'm very delighted to give a warm welcome to my probably my new line manager, which we'll get into now officially, although she's been acting that for a long time anyway. So massive credit to where credit's due. I've got Manisha Tailor here today, who's just recently been appointed or promoted to the assistant head of coaching at Queen's Park Rangers Football Club Academy. So welcome, Manisha. Thanks for coming on today.
No, thanks a lot. Looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, I know the wisdom and stuff you've got inside your head, and especially working close. We've had Chris on the podcast before, so I'm sure today's going to be a very good chat that listeners are going to get loads out. We termed this Maximising Development in Youth Football, so I know that's a passion of yours, and obviously comes under your remit today. So I hope the listeners are going to get a lot around that, and you're just excited as I am. Just before I move on, I must give a massive credit to our sponsors who have come back on board with us. RIPT is a software, so RYPT is a software platform built for performance coaches and organizations with easy to use programming tools and training load, well-being and nutrition monitoring via the RIPT app. All your coaching tools are in one place, streamlining your coaching, making it more accessible for your clients and athletes, and providing you with the insights you need to optimize performance. And to find out more, please head over to www.ript.app. That's RYPT, all capital letters, and you can use the code LOCKERROOM to get 2 months free trial over there. And last episode I said that I did with Mark was we're about to announce the collaboration with QPR Academy. Again, that's in the imminent future, so we're lucky to be bringing RIPT in on board with our full-time players here at QPR. Perfect. Okay, back to the episode. Manisha, just a quick one then. So people that a lot of our listeners come from the Gaelic football world, but we do have some football and soccer and stuff. So some of them might not know who you are. Could you just talk a little bit of a journey, how you've got into your current role today and into football, but also other things you've done as well, and just give the listeners a bit of a background. That's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I come from the educational sector, primary school trained. I fell in love with football when I was a young child. See, I grew up in a time where there were very few opportunities for women and girls. That the pathway that exists now certainly didn't look like what it does. I think it's great in the way that the women's game has evolved, like with the professionalism, the fact that you have women now who get paid to play. There's also a pathway for young girls, whereas that didn't exist when I was growing up. So, as a 9-year-old, although I went on trial to Bennett, which was our local girls' centre of excellence at the time, I got in, but for my mum at the time, it was very much around first foremost, she wouldn't be able to get me to training, so that was a barrier in itself, but purely because there was myself and also my twin brother, so he had other sporting commitments. I mean, we both enjoyed football, but he was really good at cricket and squash, so he'd have to get there. So there was no one else to take me. And the other thing really was around what would the community say. So I was born in 1980. So we talk about, over time, things have moved on. But as a youngster, I didn't see any people who looked like me playing football. And for my mum, that was quite a big thing at the time. So I knew early on I was never going to be a player, simply because of, I guess, a lack of visibility and role modelling on our part as a community, but also a real lack of pathway, particularly for me as a young girl. And I fell in love with child development at school. But I was also good at it. I remember there was an activity where, I don't know, some people might have done this as well, where you have to look after an egg, and the egg is, in essence, is a child. It's like a young baby. And if the egg cracked, you've had it, because you've obviously not done a great job. Mm-hmm. So obviously I'd done well with that. I took care of the egg, and also got a good grade in child development. And then that inspired my love for teaching. So I thought, potentially I could become a teacher, and a primary school teacher, which is what I went on to do. So I did a BA in education, but I specialised in early childhood education, and I think that in essence then lended itself to kind of where I moved on to, because although I stayed in education for 10 years, I evolved quite quickly in terms of from going in as a newly qualified teacher, and in primary schools, you teach everything from geography, history to science. And I did a little bit of PE, not very much, if I'm honest. You know, you've got 11 subjects that you're teaching, throughout, because you're teaching the whole national curriculum. And in my kind of, before I took the career change in 2011, I was a deputy head. So I got on to do my trainee headship. And at the time, it very much what was in my head was that I wanted sport to be a big part of my school. So I didn't envisage being in football. What I thought was that I would take football, because I love football, into my own school. So I passed my qualification for headship, but during all of that time, I also became a young carer when I was 18 for my twin brother, along with my family. So that completely changed the way, not only my outlook on life, but I think it certainly had an influence on the teacher and the person that I became, because of my brother's condition and the very fact that, you know, from depression, it went to schizophrenia. It progressively got a lot worse, to the point where he needed absolute one-to-one care. And he doesn't communicate verbally as we do, and he hasn't done so probably for the best part of 20 years now. So that certainly teaches you other skills, you know, especially when you're we talk about communication. Communication isn't always verbal, but I'll kind of come on to that when we talk about, you know, we really delve into the subject of coaching and transferable skill set. But during that time, in essence, I loved football, but didn't have any qualifications to coach. I just asked the head teachers in the various schools I worked in that, look, you know, the kids want to play. We don't currently have a provision, because particularly in the time when I became a teacher in the early 2000s, there was a real lack of provision for physical activity, and in various sports. So the head teacher said, yeah, why not? You know, if you think you can get some young people together, go ahead and do it. And it was one of the schools that I worked in neighboured Wembley Stadium, and it was in Wembley, and we worked very closely with Rachel Yankee and her football programme. And it started off with using, so it was Arsenal's double club, so using football as a tool to really help elevate numeracy and literacy skills with young people. And Rachel knew that I was coaching the school teams. So she said, oh, you do know that you can go and get a level 1. And pretty much got my level 1. It was 2009, 2010, was signposted straight away to get onto my level 2. And through Alex Welsh with London FA, was put on the female coach development program, which was great because it was for people who, like me, who lacked confidence, because I wasn't coaching all the time. You know, I wasn't in that environment. I was doing a bit of schools coaching, grassroots coaching on the Saturday as part of Rachel Yankee's grassroots club, which is great for me because you're there with 30 odd 7, 8, 9-year-olds with just on the grass, you know, scooping up the poo in the morning, putting up the nets and all, you know, it was great. I think that was fantastic grounding and really good experience. And the career change really was coincidence, because my home circumstance in some respect forced it to happen. And I haven't looked back since, because what I was able to do was reconnect with the people I had connected with in my time in education, but football people, because I was still involved, but it was mainly through education. So Rachel Yankee gave me some work with her football program, and I was actually doing PPA cover going into schools. I was volunteering with Middlesex, and those then transpired into roles. So I was then, as well as doing grassroots coaching, I was getting paid work, you know, on the side, was doing one-to-one tuition, supply teaching, still earn some money, was delivering the quality work with the FA and show races and the red card. And it was in 2014 when I met Chris Ramsey. We were both on a panel together, well, along with Chris Powell, talking about inclusion and diversity. But I know he wasn't at QPR at the time. He was still at Tottenham. And one of the key things he said to me was, don't rush. You need to hone in on your trade and take your time to learn. But in any case, the prerequisite to be a part-time coach or any coach in the professional game would be a UEFA B. So I went on to get my B license in 2015. and coincidentally reconnected with Chris again at Troy Townsend's Kick It Out event in April. And he said to me, "What are you up to now? What are you doing?" And I said, "Look, I've got my B license, but Middlesex are folding." So I was centre manager in my last season there, and it was in the time where there was a restructure in the female game. So Centre of Excellences were no longer going to exist because they were now going to be in the guise of a regional talent club. And we didn't get a license to become an RTC. So I was actively looking for RTC jobs. And Chris said, "Look, you can come in and volunteer, but I've got, I haven't got any jobs, but you can come in and have a look and volunteer." So I thought, okay, wow, I never ordinarily get an opportunity like that. And I suppose the rest is history, because I started to volunteer. I'm not sure if you remember, Ross, but I'd be here quite early because I'd watch, Furs with the 18s. And I remember Murray was there at the time. I'd then stay back to watch the S&C, then go over to the Dome in the evening to look at the schoolboys. I'd do some sessions in the development centre, because what I understood was you're coming from a completely different sector and an environment, and the culture is very different to primary education and the professional game. The obvious being the fact that although I was in a senior role in education, I was managing women, and there were very few male primary school teachers, and you're coming into this whole new world, I guess. And I felt that you're almost starting from scratch again, because you have to learn the philosophy, learn the way of a professional football club. And coming in to volunteer and speaking to people like yourselves and other heads of department allowed me to do that. And I remember I knew Andy Impey before. I met him through an event at Kick It Out many years before I joined QPR, and he always said to me, if ever you can connect with Chris, come in. He's really open, and what a great place it would be, to be in. And I make him right, because since I arrived, it's been really warm and welcoming. I think I've never felt out of place. There's been challenges along the way, but I think that's normal. And I feel that the element of trust from Chris, from Alex, has allowed for me to be able to show what else I could offer. And I guess that's what then lended itself to me then, I suppose, getting a job with the under-9s, and essentially in the beginning, and then through ECAS being able to be employed on a full-time basis with the funding that was available, to then go into the role of lead foundation phase, and being in the environment full-time meant, again, it provides a platform and opportunity for you to not only continue learning, but talk about other skills that show actually there is a place for diversity in skill set. So when we talk about diversity, it's not just about race and skin color, and yes, of course, that is what makes us different, but we are also different in what we can bring, and how we can ultimately help the players, help the program. And recently, like you just said, there was a role that opened up for assistant head of coaching, and I applied, and fortunately was lucky enough to get the role. And hopefully that can then inspire other women, other people who don't come from the professional game as a player, and people from diverse communities to think that these things are actually possible.
For sure. Thank you very much, Manisha. A very detailed account of where you've come from, both professionally and personally, and that's definitely added to your skill set today. Talk a little bit more about the culture aspect then. Like, as a South Asian woman, when you were growing up, football wasn't deemed as something that was a professional career or something that was respected, maybe amongst the community. How have you managed to navigate that and maybe change the way that it's looked at for you to come in full time and progress within this game?
So ultimately, the network of support's really important. So when you're a young person and you're naive, isn't it? As a 9, 10, 11-year-old or a teenager, you're naive, and you just want to be able to enjoy football. And and sometimes, unless these things are presented to you, you don't actively go out to notice difference. You don't, and I realized early on that perhaps I am different, which is why there is a lack of opportunity. And when I was in a position to try and affect change, and along with many other people who are doing work in this space, it got me to reflect and think that actually, although I grew up in an area, so I live in North London. North London's really, it's diverse, very multicultural, which is great. But having said that, football itself still didn't allow for access to equal opportunities for all, although it said, oh, we do. And one of the key things was around a network of support and access. So I was able to go on trial, but there was no one to get me to training.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the same for many other people who come from some of these, come from communities where there could be a real big talent pool, but unless you can actually get to the centers, whether it's academies, boys academies or girls academies or girls RTCs, I think we're going to lose a whole load of talent. So as I, grew older and became more aware of some of these issues that exist, and also I felt, you almost have to be in a position to influence, to create change. So once I kind of was in that type of arena, what I was then able to do was volunteer my time and link up with organizations. So one being, for example, the FA, who I've sat on the Asian Women in Football steering group for a number of years. And it's grown. It's a makeup of women, South Asian women who are in different aspects of the game. But what's good about it is it's about the sharing of ideas and the sharing of expertise, because some of the conversations that kept coming up was around, well, there's a real lack of South Asian footballers. And one of the things, and I think that we are moving forward, and there are many people now doing great things. So you've got Riz Rahman at the PFA, for instance, and some of our boys like Dylan De Silva, Aaron Drew. You've got a number of boys, Amrit as well. They're mentors for the young South Asian players, which is great. So we've got a number of, we've got about 7 or 8 across the whole academy at our place who come from the South Asian community. That's just a one club. That's not because we forced it. That's about what's our catchment. Yeah. Are we in a demographic that is diverse and multicultural? And then it's, are we open to recruitment? And is there a pathway? And yes, we can clearly see that there's transparency there. And I think, talk about the boys' game or the female game. Equally, we need to look at that, too, because some of the things around the female game at the moment is that when you look at where the girls' academies are located, they're located in leafy areas that are not accessible to people from multicultural communities. And it's, there'll be many people who may not be able to access these, therefore we're losing a pool of talent. So I think when you're in a position to be able to influence change and use your voice, for me, it was a given. It was, okay, well, I have to, otherwise, why are you in the position that you're in? You're in it for yourself, of course, because I want to grow, I want to develop. And, it's been no secret. I've always said that football keeps me connected to my brother. But I also feel there's a purpose as to why I did make this big leap, because I was on a very good salary and took a significant pay cut. So that there's got to be an intrinsic motivation on my part, which is my family circumstance. And for that reason, I feel it's important that, you do the advocacy work. So whether it's with the FA, with show races and the red card and kick it out, and be a speaker or be on panels. So with Sporting Equals recently, I became vice chair of coaching. And it's not just football, it's across the board. But again, what's great is you're able to network and you're able to use your voice and share good practice. So obviously our club being one of them, but also share good practice with what some other people are equally doing in terms of this subject.
For sure. Thank you very much, Manisha. And just briefly talk a little bit about your the ECAS scheme, which you said, which allowed some funding for you to come and work full time essentially at the club. And we were speaking yesterday about the schemes are great, but obviously then there has to be some sort of contingency and continuity of work after, and that's maybe where it lacks a little bit. Discuss that a little bit, and then obviously some experiences that have not happened for other people, opportunity coming out the other end.
So the greatest thing that ECAS did was allow opportunity. So we know currently the reason we need schemes is because there is a lack of opportunity. If everybody was treated on a fair and level playing field, we don't need bursaries and schemes, you know. So what ECAS did was allow for somebody like myself and also women. So it was people from different backgrounds and women. And the good thing was the Premier League and the FA recognizing that we clearly need to redress the balance because there's an imbalance of people who work within the professional game. And it allowed for me to become full-time because as a club, we wouldn't have, like, you know, having spoken to Chris, they wouldn't have been able to get me in full-time at that stage because we just didn't have the money and then to do so. And the jobs didn't exist anyway, you know, the jobs were already taken. So when I applied, well, in fact, Chris and Alex applied on my behalf. I applied before I was at QPR and I didn't get on. I got to interview, but the advice given was you needed more formal club experience. And I took that on board, and you can only get experience based around, you know, the access and the connections that you have. So a lot of the experience was around being in grassroots clubs. And lo and behold, when I then started to work here, I did forget about ECAS until Chris and Alex said, oh, well, it's open to Cat 2 clubs now. And if you get on it, we can get some funding to bring you in as lead foundation phase. And when I went to interview, it was interesting because it was the same people there. And it was very much about being able to show how the program can help you and what, you know, so personally and professionally. But one of the biggest learnings I got from the program was that I was already at a club. So I didn't need to be placed because in essence, what the placement does is it places you in a club. And if you're a female, already you're getting judged just on the back of that because you are getting placed in a full-time coaching role. You know, we see more women in administrative jobs now at clubs. That's great. We do not see many women on the grass. So for me, I was already in an environment that I was familiar with. You know, it was a safe environment. I knew the philosophy. So coming into the role as lead foundation phase was also almost an easier transition. And I feel that that's resulted, as well as the support from our senior managers, that's resulted in me being able to sustain my job through the ECAS program. Because when I look at other women who started on the similar journey, but were not in a club already, had to be placed in a club, are no longer at those clubs. Yeah. And I question why. And I'm not saying that, you know, it's solely to do with the program. What I'm just highlighting is the fact that there are many great things to the program. You know, the networking, the fact that you're able to meet people at different clubs, which ordinarily, you know, you wouldn't have the depth of conversations that I have done when you're away for 3 days, which and all of that's been great. And you know, some of the speakers, like for me particularly, Mitch, you know, around the physiology and the mechanics and the sports science part of it, that for me has been that was unbelievable, particularly with the way that he presented. So that there was some, you know, there was a lot of learning. But one of the things I do reflect and question is how can we ensure that people sustain their jobs when they're on the program, and what can we do better to ensure that happens before people are placed? Because it was easier for me because I was already familiar with the environment. So there's got to be some level of accountability so that you don't just then have a course for the sake of a course or a program for the sake of a program. Otherwise, what's the point in the investment? You know, you want it to create opportunity, but also to sustain people in jobs. That's the whole point, so that they become upskilled. You know, after 4 or 5 years, it's a case where, okay, you know, that they could potentially be in a position to be able to look for other jobs. What you don't want is a case where people fall out and they're now no longer on the course, and you know, and no longer maybe even in the game.
Sure, yeah, there's an issue there on both ends, isn't it? Part of the program and the openness of the club, and willingness to extend that further and value the work that's gone on during the program. But luckily, you personally, you was in the environment, you was working anyway as a coach, and that's stood you in, put you in good stead. Just bridging the gap now before we move on to more of the coaching stuff, Manisha. What transferable skills did you have personally? You spoke a lot about communication, which is a big one we'll go into in a bit more, but what about like the stuff directly from education and talking about development? What did that give you coming into a coaching in a football environment? And obviously the cultures are completely different, but the outcomes of learning, there's definitely similarities there and consistency. So what did you learn from your early years as a teacher and education and assistant head and stuff? And how did you bring that into your coaching?
So I think what you said was key there around learning and development. And I think that the biggest grounded I had was the fact that my degree was in education and my specialism was in early childhood development. So there was I felt personally that I had a level of understanding around pedagogy and child development, and that's transferable. So, you know, that phrase of ages and stages, well, that if you can understand that, then that ultimately links to anything you do when you're working with young people. So for example, you know, the simple thing of knowing that when children are younger, they're more egocentric, you know, that there's a lot of enthusiasm, that their body's still developing, they're still growing. Therefore, how you work and communicate with them will be different to young people who maybe are now not in the foundation age groups, but, you know, 11 and 12. And that in itself is going to lend itself to now greater connections, more sharing of the ball, if we're talking about, you know, the football. But I feel that understanding how children learn was one of the key things for me. And then I think, you know, when we talk about like the soft skills, so communication, having empathy, understanding difference, and not just, you know, we talk about difference, but differences in all aspects. So, you know, the fact that children learn in different ways. So being able to differentiate, being able to scaffold. People who are familiar with primary schools will know that because there are so many subjects and departments. I remember, so I was head of, at one stage, I was head of assessment, and a lot of that involved really delving into different types of assessment processes. And what I was able to do was then when I came into this environment here, although I felt I was experimenting with certain aspects and tools when I was in grassroots coaching, was around how do we really look at identifying what the kids can do and how can we then help scaffold and then challenge, but also allow them to experiment, explore and cement. And a lot of that, the baseline of learning came from when I was head of assessment or when I was in schools where we're talking about assessment for learning, which is around scaffolding, really. You know, it's how do you break information down to help children learn, but it's also continuous assessment. So, for example, if you have journals, through questioning, we can probe the kid. So, you know, if a child says, I was really good at dribbling, we can then, you know, we can question and engage the child in conversation around, well, what did that look like? You know, what the mechanics and the, you know, what side did you use? Did you use both feet? And that's, did you drop your shoulder? What was the disguise like? And that type of thing. To when you're doing like school reports at the end of a term or end of a year, and that was no different. So when you're coming into this type of environment where you are required to report on players. So a lot of that put me in good stead. What I needed to learn was a club philosophy of whatever the club, you know, in this case, it was Christian QPR, what was required of you as a coach. But had I not had that, so planning, organization, understanding of child development and learning, assessment, had I not had that, I don't think I would have been able to evolve so quickly in the position that I'm now in. If that makes sense?
Yeah, 100% makes sense, and we'll touch on that in your opinion on a coach a little bit later on. But maybe there's some key elements in there that some coaches don't have that they may be stronger at something else, the football side, the philosophy side, but that underpinning educational aspect is essential in development, which we'll touch upon. Just delving now into the really youth development content and your role per se, but also your passion around making these players better through the stages. Talk us a bit about what you think, and obviously it's going to be guided by the philosophy and your mentorship under Chris, what you think a good development program is, and feel free to take us through different ages and we have the pyramid here, that's quite apparent, and different stages of learning and chronological ages and how that changes.
So I think fundamentally, whether you're, look, this is across the board, whether it's in subjects or whether it's, like in football, that the philosophy should be determined by the player and the players that you have. Now, your framework is going to be your style of play, how you want to be able to play. But, the players that you have should determine what you coach and how you coach. So I think a philosophy that focuses or development program that does that, focuses on individual player development. We talk about being able to identify strengths and, have our lens focused on what they can do as opposed to what they can't do. And really only work on what they can't do if it if it drastically affects or hinders their strength. But with the younger ones, when you're talking about the young players, it should be very generic, that, like I said earlier, that but we're talking about young children who are very egocentric. They don't want to share, and high energy, high enthusiasm. Those how you coach and that philosophy should lend itself to knowing where is the child in their learning and their development. So, for example, tag games and individual ball work. So whether that is talk about ball mastery, but basic ball skills, so dribbling and running with the ball, and then you hone it in all the mechanical movements, and those things can be done. So to change a direction, and you'll talk about like the accels, decels, and the drop in the shoulder and the disguise. You can really hope the foot patterns, like mobility, whether that's to do with your hips, your ankle. Invasion games are multi-directional. Lots of, you've got to scan and be aware without even having to say to the player, right, today we are going to be learning scanning, awareness, and that type of thing, because they're going to be doing it anyway. Yeah. And sometimes I think people overcomplicate things with the young players. It's simplicity goes out the way, whereas the framework should be simple, and it should be geared towards where is the player at the moment, what do they need, and how can we allow them to explore and experiment and then cement. Because sometimes what we do is move things on too quickly, I think, and it becomes about a coach ego as opposed to actually what does the child need. Repetition, I think, goes across the continuum, because there's a case for, I believe, isolated practice, as well as a practice with a little bit of interference and distraction, because as much as you can learn from chaos and games, and I think that, it's a great way of really developing thinking tactics. When we talk about tactics, you can do that through 1v1s, because there's a lot to be said. Paul Holder talks about it, Paul McGuinness, Michael Carrick, Graham Carrick. So they're all talking about that there's a lot more conversations now around when we're talking about tactics. Well, what is that? Actually, that's about thinking. And we can help young players develop that through individual ball work. They're moving that onto 1v1 duels. we're going to put them in a better position for when the pitches get bigger. As they develop in their mind, they now don't mind sharing a little bit. Therefore, we're now looking at lending the ball, because that's also tying in with where they're at with regards to their stage of learning. And I think the great thing about, let's say, our philosophy, and certainly what I've learned from Chris and other, like the senior coaches, is that this is what our philosophy does. That's why we work on a development pyramid and a continuum. We allow for repetition and isolated practices to help young people develop the mechanics before moving them on to interference. Because sometimes you might go, that phrase whole part whole, you might start them off in a game, observe. You might then now have to, like Chris says to me, uses a phrase, take it back to the lab. Then you might go, well, actually, I think what we need to work on is scanning and foot patterns and preparation for receiving the ball. Because if we can work on that and they're able to open out their hip, then maybe that's going to lend itself to them being able to take a first touch, so it's in their personal space and not so it bobbles. That you might then take that back to the lab. You might do some isolated block work and then bring it back. So I think adaptability is also key, because it's having a framework, then looking at who are the players that you've got in your group, what are their identified strengths, how are you then scaffolding to allow them to learn, is it appropriate to the age and stage of learning, and also bearing in mind that within the group of 10, 12, 18 that you have, they're all going to be different in their learning. Is the practice for you or for them? And at the end of it, what's in it for all of them? So you can have one practice, as we know, you can have one practice that allows for all players to work on what it is that they need to work on. And then, as you go up, as we know, that will become a little bit more bespoke. But you think about, like, that our basic practice, we've got a defensive arena. You can work on, you can either have the emphasis as a defensive one and work on checking your shoulders, scanning, defensive foot patterns, distances within a unit, blocking, tackling, or it can be the attacking emphasis. And for some, it might be around forward runs. For others, it might be around maintaining possession, combination, having the play in front of you. So you can then work, the emphasis can change, but the practice itself doesn't. But it then caters for whatever the players need. And then we can make that a little bit more role and job specific as they're, as they get older.
Really good detail there, Manisha. Thank you. A couple of things just to hone in on, because I think it's interesting you said about, I think sometimes we move practice on too quickly, because and this from my experience as well, in your head, you're thinking, well, we need to move it on now. The players are getting bored, but actually the players aren't getting bored. The coach is getting bored. So that's important to say, well, have the players mastered this practice, or have they got their outcomes out that you want from it? If they haven't, then you stick with it for the required time. Is that something you see quite often in practice?
Yeah, and I think you said something key there, which is, have we got the outcomes that we want? And actually, I think and it's, when we talk about reflection, I think we are becoming, as a fraternity, a lot more reflective, which is great. That is it about the outcomes we want, or is it about the outcomes that the players need to get? Because sometimes that can also differ, because in our head we might think, okay, we want them to be able to do this, but does that correlate with what the player actually needs? Because I think biases also set in sometimes with particular things. So I've seen it many times, and I've been guilty of doing it early on, but you have to reflect, you have to learn, you have to take on board information from, good people you have around you who can help you with understanding, I'm saying readiness. So I remember I did psychology A-level, but even in my, when I was doing my BA in education, we talked about like Piaget, and there were other psychologists in terms of their theories, and readiness was a big part of development and learning. That why are we moving it on if they haven't grasped the basic concept? So you think about, talk about like receiving the ball. If, oh, well, they can't really receive it properly. Oh, you know, it's you want it in your personal space as a dead touch, but it's bobbling all over the place. But yet we haven't allowed them to develop ball feel and, you know, a basic control, whether that's through, you know, core skills, whether that's through juggling, whatever it might be, but we haven't allowed for that to happen. What we've done is moved them on to B without really focusing on A. So I think it's having greater understanding. My recommendation would be is having greater understanding of the connections. We talk about connections between players. So 1v1, you know, your connection between you and the defender, or, you know, you 2v1, 2v2, etc. But there's also the connection over, in order for them to be able to receive, let's break that down. What do the core ingredients look like? Okay, what do they need to be able to do? They need to be able to open it. And then we've got our glue with the awareness, movement, timing, execution, but Paul McGuinness equally has done a lot of work. So it's been really honed in and ingrained on my A license around, you know, deception, movement, technique, scanning. Those things are really so we say it's the glue. That's your core ingredients, isn't it? It's like, you can't just have a cake. You have to have things to put into the cake. This is no different. You know, that before we get them to receive on a half turn, have we worked on the mechanics, the ball feel, the touch, the scanning, the opening out of the hips, the arms, you know, what's your head doing? Have we worked on those things, or are we just moving them on very quickly? So like you said, I think, yeah, I've seen that. And I think a key thing would be to go back and think about what's your overall, or what is it that we want to achieve for the players? How are we going to help them do that? That's your key ingredient. You know, all those things I spoke about in terms of scanning, you know, perception, foot patterns and stuff. All of that comes into core ingredients. Then you take that back to the lab and go, what practices can we design to allow for that to happen? Then you go back into, right, we want to go into receiving, combination play, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Manisha. And hopefully the more experience, then I guess the better the coach gets. What the coach would like out of the practice should lend to what the players need out of the practice, and that should marry up. But you're right, in times it doesn't. Another point just before we move on was around isolated practice and what I would say close skill practice, which is a big topic always in the coaching and pedagogy, especially newer schools of thoughts and around development. But I think, as you said, even with the young, like under nines practice and the foundation phase, where you've got your tag games, where you're getting your awareness of scanning without explicitly breaking that down and coaching it, even though you might take that back to the lab at some point, but then you've also got your individual ball work. The combination of the two and how you marry one and scaffold one and talk about mechanics, talk about individual movement, break it down where the players can actually understand it, and then how that goes into a chaotic game with interference, distractions, and the game itself. That's the key, isn't it? To make sure that they learn that broken down skill and it goes into the game. You can't just put them into the game and say, well, you've got to check your shoulders and you've got a one bouncer pass to the right winger, because you haven't worked on that. So that's where I think that theory gets broken down. I mean, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'd say what you said was key, because that's where we're not all experts in all these different fields. And that's why I think working as an MDT is really crucial, because that's where you might go to your sports science team and have a conversation around, okay, we want to work on certain movements. How can we do it so that they're football movements? Because I think there's also the element of where it becomes disjointed is that you have a sports science team doing a warm-up, and then there's no link to actually it going into the football part, whereas there should be synergy between that, because they should be football movements and not isolated movements. You know, we're just going to run with it, or we're just going to do sprinting and so on. And I understand there is a place for that. I completely understand that, but I think generally I'm saying that's where, like you said, speaking with the experts in those particular areas and planning together will allow for that to happen, because you are not going to be the expert in all of those areas.
Yeah, agree. And even just an understanding that if somebody's not doing what you think is at the right level, or is underperforming or failing, as we like to say in certain things. You can't just keep putting them into that game scenario and expecting them to get better and better. You have to, as Chris said, take them to the lab and really break down what it is they need to improve on. Okay, moving on, Manisha, and probably a lesson for me. You can talk to me a little bit. What, in your eyes, within your remit and your phase, what makes a good coach? And it might change, as you said, at younger ages and as it gets a bit more specific and you're honing in on different skills. But what makes a good coach that you see on the grass, and how they affect change with players?
I think we can all say fundamentally you need to have subject knowledge. You need to have a baseline of subject knowledge, but you can have subject knowledge and not be able to connect with the players. And as we know, Chris talks about connection as being the biggest part of any coach, and being able to communicate and get the best out of them. You know, how many of us know what the kids like to do outside of football, or what they've done, but what their favorite films or foods are, and that type of thing. So I think getting to know the players, connecting with them, I think having energy and enthusiasm. The younger the players are, you're almost acting, aren't you? You know, there's got to be that bundle of energy, because your enthusiasm, you'll impart that onto the kids, and they've got so much energy and drive. It's I think so that the younger they are, that's really important. Being somebody who's going to be empathetic and open. I think someone who's going to challenge their own biases, definitely, because like you said, you have different types of players, doesn't matter what age and stage, across the whole development continuum. And sometimes your own biases can affect how you coach and what you observe and see. So I think challenging your own biases, becoming more reflective, being observant, but really knowing what you're observing, which goes back to subject knowledge, being open to working in partnership with other departments, leaving your ego at the door, and really recognizing that we are here to develop players to be the best that they can be, because we know the statistics are so low that the majority of those who come to us are not going to be professional footballers. What we want to be able to do is make sure that they have not only a great time, but they have a real learning experience that makes them rounded. They come away as better footballers, but more importantly, as good people. And they can come away with all these skills, and it might be in other salaried football, it might be in education, or something else, But that I think is really important. And the only other thing I've had, but I've spoken a lot about it already, is around a real understanding of development and learning. Because whether you are working with an under 23 or an under 9, they are still in development, And I think that unless we really understand how children learn, it becomes very difficult to help them.
Yeah, and a first team player. Everyone's learning, and trying to improve. I think it's important, and especially into senior, into county and senior club from the Gaelic perspective as well. Manisha, thank you very much. Just bringing that on then to the training session, the individual training session. A lot of listeners will want to know, what's your views on setting up the training session? I know we spoke a lot about it laterally and inadvertently, and it will depend on what you're focusing on, what the outcome is. But what do you look at when you're designing training sessions for a session to have good outcome and get the learning outcomes that you want from it?
So I'll say, look, one of the biggest things I've learned from Chris over my time here, and how we plan is that people who know QPR know the plans are done. It is very rigid in that respect. We've got, Chris has already designed the practices, but the key learnings I've taken from Chris are this, and we've seen it work, is that simplicity. It's not, don't keep changing the practices. Be confident in yourself and be patient to keep the practices the same. But the more you understand the principles and you work to a style of play as opposed to a theme. Today we're just going to work on playing out from the back and so on. The more I think you'll see long-term benefits. So I'll give an example. If we're doing hit the blue, which is a pivot play practice, you can have the emphasis is going to be around pivot play and midfield movement, combination play, and so on. But you can have a defending emphasis too, and still do hit the blue, because you can work on swarming, and just keep working, and breaking down different aspects of defending, and do that over a number of weeks, and do the attacking part over a number of weeks. But there's always a yin and a yang, as Chris says, isn't it? So if you're attacking, you still got to be able to, you're going to defend to regain possession. So I think simplicity, don't keep changing the practices, because the more we do that, the players have to learn rules. And most of the time, the session becomes about learning the rules, and they get very little contact and ball time. Be patient, because development's a journey, and be patient in the respect of you don't have to keep changing things. A lot of that's going to come from your enthusiasm. So as much as over at our place, the sessions are prescribed, our personalities are different, and our charisma and how we execute and deliver the session is going to be different. And the more enthusiastic we are about it, that will rub off on the players, and the players don't get bored, like the coaches get bored. And the only final thing I'd say on it is around just, be clear with your principles, so there is a place for where people coach to themes, which is fine. But as we know, on a pitch, they're in one of, they're either in, we talk about score, make or stop, or, talk about they're either scoring goals, assisting, maintaining, or getting something out of it, or defensively, they're either winning the ball back, making play predictable, supporting the first defender, or in some type of team function. And we can't always just stick to, well, we're only going to look at build-up play, we're only going to look at creating and combination play, because what we've also got to consider is what we've spoken about, which is making sure all the players get what they need, and the fact that through the game, it's so fluid, isn't it? You're in these things all the time. Yeah. So it's being clear on your principles, and coach, we coach the principles, don't we?
For sure. Just as you said that, I moved the laptop round because we got the in possession, out of possession checklist on the backdrop there. So things that you were speaking about. I think that's important, because look, I've been in it firsthand, where for a 6-week block we've coached the same stock practice, and obviously you've added phases and small-sided games, large-sided games. You've changed the things around the stock practice, but it's about what you focus on in the practice. So you're saying they're playing out from the back. Well, you can play out from the back and hit the blue. You can set your 2 centre halves up and talk about serving into the blue. You can relate stuff into these stock practices that you just need to think about the game and the LPs in a little bit more detail. Brilliant. Thanks, Manisha. Just moving on a little bit, I know you spoke a lot about individual approach within the sessions, and especially at the first part of it. It's becoming a real hot topic at the minute, individualization, but this has been around for years in terms of, way back when I was at Chelsea years ago. I know Chris has been talking about it for years, and even since I come from QPR, the individualization is key. What extra bits, apart from the individualization within the sessions, taking it back to the lab, you might get unit work. What else does that really mean to you, that individual approach mean to you about getting that player to the next stage or ultimately over the line?
I think similar to what I've said earlier, which is we talk about understanding what the player needs, but in order to understand the player what the player needs, we need to understand the subject. So, and that's why I talk about, we talk about diverse skill set. That's why I think you do need different types of people, because you're going to have people who are better equipped at that and other people who are better equipped at understanding learning and development. So you can marry that together. So it's having the subject knowledge to then understand what do players need, then being able to identify what is their strength. Then you need to allow time for this individual to develop. So patience, an understanding of that, the age and stage, understanding that as they develop, there'll be various contributing factors such as growth, adolescence, and many other things, their body changing, pitches getting bigger from when they're young to when they're older, all these different dynamics, friendships, things that happen outside of school. So it's more than just the football, it's more than just here. So when we talk about that individual player development, it's got to be very holistic, which is why working with different heads of departments whether it's medical, psychology, sports science, and so on. I think that's key.
Yeah, really is. And I think it's now good to see that the norm is becoming this individualized approach and different ways that get spun on it. I know you've got to go soon, Manisha, so I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll wrap up. I'm sure there could be a part 2 to this as well. There's a lot of talk around development and winning, especially within the games program, about winning games. And there's always an argument to say that even within development, you need to create that winning mentality and to be able to win games. And I even look at the Euros at the minute, and you look at countries like Italy, for example, who my wife comes from, so I know a lot about them now. And it's from early on, they're very competitive. They want to win games, and you can see that in them. And maybe that's something from the development. What's your thought process on that in terms of the games program and about getting the most for the individual, not sacrificing the individual outcomes, but then still trying to get some winning mentality at some point in the pyramid to prepare them for later on?
So I think what you said there was actually the key part, which is understanding where they are. So we talk about winning mentality. Look, we all want to win. You want to win football matches. But I think what's important is about teaching competitiveness. It's you want to develop players to be competitive, confident, be able to. We talk about resilience, but that we can also relate that to competing, can't we? That being put in different situations. So are they in when we play like some of the Premier League tournaments, and they're in that has an outcome, and the outcome is if we don't win the games, you get knocked out. To when you're back in your own environment, where that isn't necessarily the outcome, but then it is when you get to retain release age groups, because there's an outcome there. So I think the most important thing when we talk about this winning mentality, yes, it is about winning a football match, we know, but actually we've got to look beyond that, which is also about competing. It's also about putting them in situations to allow them to be able to withstand adversities and challenges and be adaptable, because they are going to be put in different situations. They go on tour, that's competitive. You get, again, that there's a knockout aspect to that. They go to the other tournaments, there's a knockout. You've got retain release. There's so many, I think, contributing factors and areas that link to winning. I think putting them in situations, like I said, to compete will allow them to withstand adversity and teach them to be adaptable, because ultimately that's what we want. We want adaptable learners. We want learners who are going to be resilient, to be able to manage and cope and have various mechanisms in their toolbox to overcome, to help them overcome challenge.
Yeah, totally agree, Manisha. We had a whole section on your ambassador work within ethnic minorities, which you touched upon at the start. So I think we'll park that for a part 2, because we spoke so much about the philosophy and coaching. But I must say, the list is exhaustive in a positive way when you see all your achievements you've had in that area and trying to enforce change. And you're an MBE, you've got an MBE, so massive congratulations on that. Thank you so much for your time today, Manisha. It's been great to chat to you, and we'll definitely schedule a part B and a part 2 to go through a few things.
No, thanks. It was great. Yeah, really good conversation.
Thank you very much, Manisha. And just before we go for listeners, I must refer back to our sponsors, RIPT. RIPT can help you simplify the creation and delivery of training programs, making it easier to provide your everyday clients or your athletes and teams' needs at a fingertip with their training app. Training load, well-being, and nutrition monitoring is all part of the picture, so it creates an overall profile. To find out more, again, please head over to www.ript.app and use the code LOCKERROOM to get your 2 months free trial. Thank you very much for Cormac coming on board with us. And again, thank you to Manisha, a very good insight around coaching and development. I'm sure listeners are going to get a lot from it. Thanks, Manisha. I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks. All right, bye.